there was an explosion of African American land accumulation after emancipation in 1865. So we went from owning 1% of all farmland in Texas in 1870 to owning 31% of all farmland by 1910. The Texas Freedom Colonies Atlas and Study began as a spreadsheet, probably the last time we were talking, has grown not only into an online portal where you can access information about individual places, but now we've added what are called map layers. So you can look and see the relationship between where a freedom colony once was and its vulnerability to hurricanes, population change. You can see the relationship between changes in the environment as well as where people have moved from and to over time. And so more directly, as I begin to talk about Texas Freedom Colonies and what they are, I want to make sure I contextualize them for you and situate them in a broader history of African American intentional community building. To be clear, not institutions or places where we were pushed, not places we lived in by default, but places we purposefully developed and built. What's significant about Texas Freedom Colonies is that in several instances, we're talking about settlements that Thad Sitton and James Conrad discuss in Freedom Colonies, Independent Black Texans in the time of Jim Crow, that they characterize as dispersed communities, settlements. Southerners often call them places unplatted and unincorporated, individually unified only by a church and school and residents' collective belief that a community existed. Freedom colonies emerged from 1865 to 1920, from the point at which we speak today of our emancipation here in Texas. But prior to that, the relationship between accumulating land and enslavement and founding Texas are important to note as well. Because for every 80 acres, or rather for every enslaved person that a new settler of Texas brought with them in the 1820s and 30s, they accumulated an additional 80 acres of land. While conversely, once we were emancipated in 1865, due to the black codes which were passed by the state legislature, we were not even able to take advantage of publicly available land to homestead. So we have this steady behind the eight ball, so to speak, situation, which is why it's so notable that in 1870 we owned 1% of all farmland in Texas, and by 1910 rather, we owned 31% of all farmland in Texas. So we have this not only coming over the threshold of emancipation, but being institutionally by our own government inhibited from accumulation of land and overcoming those odds. Very often the anchor of these communities, that is the center of the community that really defined it as a place, was the existence of a school. There were several types of schools. We talk frequently about Rosenwald schools, but there were also Gene Fund schools. And these are shared investment. That is, a foundation would put up a portion of funds, and that community itself would put up a matching set of funds. And that would then create a school, a home for the person who was teaching in the school. So they also built homes and also built shops, workshops, where people would learn trades, such as being a carpenter. So as many of you already know, we're sitting here in an HBCU, of course, but the roots of HBCUs are intertwined with the history of emancipation. And what do I mean by that? There is an association, the American Missionary Association. And this association was a group of white missionaries. And they were very pivotal in helping fund and begin several HBCUs. Fisk University, Hampton Institute, Tougaloo College, Atlanta University, Dillard University. And often adjacent to, close, nearby these institutions were freedom colonies, that is, historic black settlements. So we have on our map 357 dots, And the work of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project and my own individual research is to find out what happened to them. So if you could imagine, 357 of a list of 557 places. That means we're trying to understand what was the original boundary of all of those places, how many people still live there, how many people can say that they're still descended from those places. That is the work of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project. So in my mind, when people say how many still exist, I always say every single one of them still exists. Well, what if no one lives there anymore? They exist in the imagination, they exist on homecoming when people come to gather there by the hundreds. They exist when people return to check on their family's property or even to move back into that property. And so we have an inheritance in these places. And it's up to descendants and African Americans to think through how we want to claim and make the most of that inheritance. And in that way, I would say every one of them still exists. But what the idea or the concept of a freedom colony is today, and what I argue in my work, is the idea of free Black space. That is a free Black imaginary or an ideal that I think in many ways, as we confront problems with the criminal justice system, as we confront, as I keep saying, a lack of investment in our communities, a lot of flight from our communities, as we're confronting these perennial problems that challenge us, we're finding that there's a lot of knowledge from our ancestors when they began these communities, when they founded them out of nothing, that we can use today to counteract efforts to decimate Black communities. And so I really operate under the idea of Sankofa. It's a symbol I use to symbolize freedom colonies and the work I do. And it's about looking at the past before you move forward. So it's about looking critically at the past, not that it was perfect, not that it was an ideal, but what is it we can take from their approaches to cooperative economics? What can we learn from the ways that they recycle building materials to create institutions? What is it we can learn from their problem solving and the ways that they interacted and cared for one another that we can apply now to addressing all of our biggest challenges? That's, to me, what the future of freedom colonies is looking at how we can apply those best practices to building stronger and better communities today.
What are your thoughts on education being the foundation for civil rights and the success of that movement?
So what we have to understand is that even before the modern civil rights movement, what it meant to be free was to have the choice to determine who you were going to make a contract with to work, and it also meant the right to read and write. Something that we completely take for granted, but during enslavement we could not read or write. That was grounds for death. And so one of the first things that was important right after emancipation was learning to read and write, or actually admitting that you knew how to read and write. And so that perpetuated itself throughout our history. And so when we get to the civil rights movement, we're really looking to our teachers and to all of those learned people who weren't necessarily on the front lines marching, but they were the people who were the places where there were fundraisers and there were meetings and there were gatherings of people, right? So we had these educated folks as real leaders. Not necessarily rich folks, but even your everyday school teacher who was really there to instill greatness and an aspirational spirit in the community, and also to create a foundation for how it is people would organize, how people would come together. They had the spaces where people would come together, were schools and churches. And so in that way, they were foundational institutions in which to organize. They created a class of folks who were able to fundraise and organize. In that way, they were foundational.